Welcome to Margo Talbot Unplugged. Today's guest is Ken Wylie. In 2003, Ken was an apprentice ski guide when he was caught in an avalanche and buried for 45 minutes. After he was dug out, he realized that 7 of his clients had perished in the tragedy. Welcome to the show, Ken.
I'm glad to be here.
Something I've always wanted to ask you. What was the first thing that went through your mind after you were dug out of the snow?
A deep feeling of, how the hell am I going to get out of this one? But there was no getting out of it. And I think that I was feeling very, very adolescent, like extremely adolescent. Like, boy, I've really done it this time, and I have to figure a way of getting out of this.
So really done it this time. We know that the training is very rigorous to become a mountain guide. When I hear you say, how am I going to get out of this one? What I hear is you were very trained at being in the mountains and taking people on objectives, but when the tragedy hit, you felt wholly unprepared. Would that be a fair thing to say?
I had never run the algorithm in my mind of being in an event like that where I survived. That algorithm did not exist in my being. It was always, if something bad happens, I won't have to live the consequence. I'll probably die. And that was the shocker, was that I lived. I had no preparation for it whatsoever. And I think that was probably an egoic algorithm where, if something bad happens, I'll be martyred and I won't have to deal with it or whatever, right? Like, and it's, I think that fundamentally it was a really immature approach.
So another way to put it is you encountered the unimaginable.
I had never imagined. It was imaginable, and I think these kinds of things are imaginable, but I never allowed myself to imagine that outcome. And so, among a whole kind of list of flaws in my approach to the mountains, fundamentally that was the biggest one, because I never really, because I think that if I had run the algorithm of, there might be a tragedy that I survive, I might have taken things a lot more seriously.
So how many people did survive?
Well, there were 13 people buried that day. I can't imagine having to respond to a situation like that. There were 8 on the surface, and I wouldn't trade my experience for theirs ever. Like, those people need deep compassion because they dug out their friends that were no longer living. So 13 people were buried, and there were 6 that were rescued, and I was among the 6 that were rescued, and 7 perished. And that number 7 in my life has been a really important number. I was the 7th in my family. Number 7 has when I competed in the X Games, I finished 7th in speed and 7th in difficulty, and kind of this. It's been this whole
recurring
number that is important and important for a whole bunch of reasons. But I think that my approach initially was, how am I going to get out of this one? And I had a get out of jail free card. I was an assistant guide. And so how that manifested in the community was that the guide took all the heat. all the heat. And, you know, I wouldn't have wanted to be him. And so I was hiding in the shadows, and I could have remained there. Actually, I tried to remain there for as long as I could, and that became completely unsustainable.
How long was the period between being dug out of the snow and realizing you lived in your client's parish to when you realized you could no longer hide in the shadows?
So the avalanche happened in 2003. In 2008, I recognized that I was living a lie, and I needed to go on walkabout and start to figure things out. And the community thought that I went nuts. But essentially what happened was I needed to stop. I needed to stop doing everything and start paying attention.
So what was the sign that caught your attention? Was it a thought, a feeling? Was it a physical manifestation? What made you stop?
Well, I think that you know, there's so many facets to it, but primarily one of the things that I was struggling with is that I'd get up in the morning and I'd go to the bathroom and I'd look in the mirror and I didn't like who I saw. And that's and you know, I perceived that was probably a feature in my life long before any snow sled. And I think that was one of the reasons why I was so hell-bent on adventure, is that I wasn't enough to myself.
So it was a proving ground. Adventure was a proving ground for you.
Yeah, and so, and then, you know, I didn't like who I saw, and so I think deep down there was this little voice that was saying, so what are you going to do about it? And this life of facade that I had constructed, I needed to stop and start taking that apart. And that was really frickin' scary. It was unbelievably scary. Because I needed to start telling the truth about everything. I needed to start telling the truth about why I was engaged in adventure, and I needed to start telling the truth about how I participated in the tragedy. And I didn't know what those truths were at all. Not at all. I just had this sense that there's something really big that I need to do, and it terrifies me. And I needed to do it, and nobody understood it.
So it was like the ultimate solo journey into the depths of your psyche.
Yeah, and I would say that within kind of the wisdom of being human, like if we look back at, you know, kind of across the millennia of the wisdom that we've gathered of, you know, about the human journey, there were people who understood it, but at the time, I had no idea that any of that existed. And so what it felt like was, I'm going off into the abyss and I don't know what's going to happen.
There was no guidebook. There were no waypoints. There was no topographical map. If I could just back us up for a bit, I know you suffered a lot of losses after that event, personal losses, professional losses. If you could just go over a few of those losses and how and why you thought they happened, and was that what led you to the '08 point? Or was that part of it?
Yeah, you know, I think that fundamentally the first and biggest loss was innocence. I think that ignorance is incredibly empowering, And that's why we see, young adventurers going out and, doing like incredible things, is because the link to consequence isn't there yet. And that's a beautiful thing, but it's also a potentially dangerous thing and tragic, and can lead to tragedy. And 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 so that was fundamentally the first loss, was the loss of innocence. This idea that, this adventure thing is nothing but beautiful. It was horrible.
In an instant.
In an instant. It was absolutely horrible. I was in Revelstoke, and Nancy and I were building a house in Revelstoke, and the house was almost ready. We were weeks from moving in, but we hadn't moved in yet. But that was our address, and that's where the vans with satellite dishes were congregating. They were trying to find me. We were living in a rental house that had, that was basically anonymous, and that kept me from the media. And I remember like crawling out of kitchen windows and running down alleyways and trying to stay away from the media. It was horrible. And they wanted me to put words to what just happened. But what we don't understand in our society is that when something like this happens, we don't have words. There are, I'm quoting Carol Yates, who lost her husband, who was one of my guests in my group. There are no words. But we crave the soundbite, we crave understanding, we crave... I'm still trying to understand what happened, and it's still a process. I'm still learning from what happened. And if I were to, encapsulate, what I experienced into the soundbite now, I'd say it was Ken Wylie's rite of passage. It was like I was a boy, and I was being asked to be a man. And so it was the boy that was dug out, who wanted to figure out a way to make this go away. But as humans, we don't experience these things for them to go away. We experience these things to integrate them. And whatever we experience, if we experience cancer, or if we experience a car accident, or if we experience some sort of tragic event in our lives, the work is always integration. Like the question becomes, so what are you going to do with this? How are you going to own this? How are you going to make this something that becomes a gift for your community? And fundamentally, I think that we have a responsibility to do that, as opposed to run from the things that we experience. The universe is asking us, or inviting us, to go on that journey of integrating what we've experienced and making it valuable. So that we, and I'm paraphrasing Joe Campbell, so that we have a gift, that we come back with a gift to the community, right? Like we go on this journey and we face all of these things that scare us to the core of our being. But what's really fascinating is that, let's say that somebody says something to us about ourselves that we don't like. Like somebody says, say somebody says to me about the avalanche accident, you guys were really stupid going there. My response now would be, you're right. It was like the dumbest thing that I've ever done. And I now know exactly why I went there. And it's way deeper than just being careless. It was personality features that were coming across my path long before any snow slid. And so there's these things that we find frightening or scary when we just own them. When we say thank you to the person that says, you guys were really stupid. It's like, thanks, we were, right? And in that, when we see somebody else's tragedy, when we see somebody else's mistake, we see the last decision that they made. And little do we know that there's hundreds of decisions that brought us to that point. And at any point we can kind of go, I can see the trajectory of this and I don't like it. And one of the features of why I was there was that I lacked the courage to say that. I lacked the social courage to say, I can see where this is going and I'm not participating in this. And fundamentally, that's what I perceive adventure to be about. It's not about what we do. It has very little to do with what we do and what we achieve. It has everything to do with who we become. And if that becomes the journey of adventure, then we won't have to justify anything about what we do off in the mountains. People will notice, wow, when Margo goes out ice climbing and she comes back better. Not only does she come back, because if we mature through the process of adventure, we make better decisions, so we're more likely to come back, but then we come back better. We come back resonating maturity.
Well, on that note, we first met in 1994. And
I'm laughing because I understand the kind of person I was then, yes.
and as do I. You are a completely different person now than the man I met in 1994, and that is rare. And it's rare because most of humanity, most humans are programmed to be a certain way, and they just stay that way. Unless something very traumatic or dramatic happens to them. And so in the Don Juan books of Yaqui sorcery, they call it the assemblage point. You're born kind of a clean slate. You start getting programmed by your family and your culture, and then you become this personality called Ken Wylie in your case. Very few people move through a process where they come out the other side completely different, the way I've watched you come out. And so I guess that's the process that you're describing with us today. So if 2008 was the point at which you decided to start taking responsibility and not hiding in the shadows, then it was 6 years later that you produced what I'm assuming is your gift back to the community, mm-hmm. which is your book, your memoir.
Mm-hmm. And all of that was terrifying. And it was not an easy process. Like, I remember when I sat down to reflect on, kind of what happened and why, I started to write a expose of, why I'm not to blame or why I'm not accountable. And that just didn't work. And it didn't work not only for me kind of personally, but it didn't work in the physical realm. I could not get my computer to work. It kept crashing. And some people would say, oh, that's woo, and it's, circumstances. But that's what I'm talking about, is that I needed to go through a process of noticing. Like, there's resistance to this path here, and so I need to try something different. And just noticing that and choosing to do something different. And so then I started writing stories, and the stories seemed to have no connection to snow sliding in the Selkirk Mountains of British Columbia in 2003. It was adventures that I'd been on long before. And what I unearthed from those stories was the process that I was missing. Processes around understanding courage, processes around understanding connection and how to connect with other people and other beings and the landscape and myself, how to connect with myself. I was so disconnected from myself. And because I was so disconnected from myself, and because I didn't know how to tell the truth. And by truth, I mean congruence with what's happening inside with what I present to the world outside. And because I wasn't going through that process of being congruent with, my internal landscape and the external environment, I was in my head. I was battling. I was always going on a battle. And because I was in that battle, I couldn't see what was happening with the people around me. And I couldn't see what was really happening in the environment. So I was so broken, chiefly because I was in cognitive dissonance, and so part of my rite of passage was that start being congruent. Start like, regardless of how people are going to respond to what I say, that's their choice. And that was really hard. And I would write a sentence and I'd have to say to myself, I'm incongruent. I'd have to enter, backspace and rewrite the sentence. And is the book perfect? No, absolutely not. But is it what I was able to do? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So back to this point of incongruency, I think a lot of people live there. We live in a society where things are constantly coming at us. It's almost like our senses and our psyches are bombarded with external stimuli. And what I hear you saying is you went from a process of being a receiving tower for all of this external information, and you alchemized it to the point where you became the repeater station, or the tower that emits the beam. And what I'm thinking about is I've thought a lot about empowerment in my journey, my own personal journey. And to me, being a victim is the opposite of empowerment. And so you said that you could have been the victim. The first drafts that you wrote, you could have cast yourself as a victim. And there may not have been anything wrong with that. There may be elements where you did feel like things were not in your control or your fault, but that something inside of you kept tugging at you and moving your needle toward responsibility.
Yes.
and self-empowerment.
Yes. And what's interesting is that the truth is always bigger. It's always bigger than we allow ourselves to entertain, because we like things to be binary. And I would say that I was both. I was victim and perpetrator. Right? Like, fundamentally, I was there as an assistant to learn. And the culture and the approach and the whole way of being was dripping in hubris. And I allowed it. So it's both. And I was being asked to participate in a culture of hubris. And every cell in my body knew that was wrong. But I followed. I allowed myself to be the victim. And And so those two truths can exist together. And so, one part of that truth is my responsibility. Yes, I allowed myself to follow. That's my responsibility. That's my work. That's my contribution. But the work of the community, which is still waiting, is to recognize and own the culture of hubris. And that may never happen in my lifetime. And I would call that out to be unethical, because it is. We're in the adventure space. We're being asked to take risks in order to become our best selves, not to fuel our egos. That's a profoundly, like, that goes against everything that you'll ever read about the human journey and what we're here to do. Will encourage you not to fuel your own ego. And it's a constant process, like it's a practice to become aware. And so, this whole process that so, to check that for myself, this whole process that I've described to you, like, I went on this journey and, I wrote a book and, I gained some insights about, why I showed up the way I was showing up. Did I fuel that? Absolutely not. I was being guided. And I was being guided by something that I don't have words for. But it wasn't something that, I was being spoken to. And I think that that's part of the human condition, but I also think that we can easily shut it off as being not real. But that grand mystery is real. And so for me, kind of the other kind of, you asked the question of what was the loss? Well, the loss was a loss of innocence, but the gain was recognizing mystery. The other things that I lost, kind of coming back to that question, there was a profound loss of, and it didn't happen all at once, but I lost the ability to continue to construct facade. And what that means is, I guess a word is an effort to be authentic. And again, I'll say that it's a practice. It's not an arrival. Like I struggle with the same stuff over and over and over again. But it's like a meditation. Like when you notice yourself wandering or your mind wandering, you bring yourself back. You notice your mind wandering, you bring yourself back. And that's my experience of kind of the human journey of becoming aware, is that the awareness is, oh, that's happening again. I need to bring myself back. Oh, that's happening again. I need to bring myself back. And that's a worthwhile practice.
So down through the ages, we've been given practices like meditation, potentially like mindful movement meditations, yoga. We've also been given great works of literature, like Homer's Odyssey, Dante's Inferno, that describes in allegory what it's like to traverse this landscape of the unknown, where you start your life and you're given waypoints and you're given a compass, and then something like tragedy hits, and all of a sudden those get blown out of the water and they don't even work anymore. You're in a new land. You're on a new planet and you're alone. So you've got the allegory or the archetypes or the metaphors, but you're basically blind moving through darkness. And you have to rely on nonverbal cues. For instance, someone may be talking to you literally, but often it's our conscience. Often it's a feeling in our body that something just isn't right, even if we can't define it. And it's like an invisible language of the soul. Or it's like a letter written in our hearts that we can only read by descending into the depths of our psyches.
Yeah, the depth, we live in the depths of our psyches. Like, we live in darkness. Like, and how we behave is, kind of in reactionary ways. And, we have dreams at night, and that's our psyche speaking to us. And so the question then becomes, well, not how do I, look at my dark side? It's how do I notice that I'm living there? How do I notice that, and how do I find my way? How do I navigate to this beautiful potential that I have as a human being? How do I navigate myself to there? And what's really fascinating from the adventure space is that adventurers are finding their way there. I mean, these flow experiences that, that extreme athletes are having, that is pure light. And then we come back to the valley and we're back in, potentially our shadow. And I experienced that in the mountains. Like, I remember doing like great things up on ice climbs, and then coming back to the valley and being incredibly arrogant about them. Like, unbelievably arrogant. Like, I remember Francois Damilano in Canmore at the Drake comes up to Keith Haverl and I and says, "I know you guys by reputation." And I said, "Yeah, who the hell are you?" As I've said to other people. And that's shadow. I've lived my life in shadow. And I think that, and I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to own it. I didn't want to own, kind of how horrible I was behaving. Mostly out of fear. Mostly out of, not accepting myself. Mostly, kind of around my own inability to just love who I am. And, in my book, I describe my life of a journey in part. There was, it's not so black and white. It's kind of like there's many facets to being an adventurer. But one aspect of it was a long suicide attempt. I was depressed. And most people wouldn't have recognized that. But I was depressed. And I needed to achieve. I had to achieve. And so, my experience of adventure was that I was engaged in an addiction. I remember saying to my wife, "I don't want to climb with you. You don't climb hard enough." Like, who says that? Right? Like, and so, I was isolating myself from the people that were, most important in my life. And so what happened when tragedy struck was that, holy shit, I haven't been building really valuable relationships with the people in my life. And so now I really feel alone. And did I tell them how I felt about, what I was experiencing? No. My birthday is 3 days after the avalanche, and there was a rebirthday party thrown for me at my home in Revelstoke, kind of a week after. And I remember the community being happy that I'd survived. Deep inside, I was like devastated. But I remember putting on this facade of, yeah, this is great. And I'm ashamed of that. I'm ashamed that I couldn't be how I was feeling. And I think that the community was also unprepared. The community, we do not know how to traverse difficulty in our community. We do not know how to be with somebody who's in pain. This dissonance that, kind of is a feature in our culture, and to be empathetic is to actually allow ourselves to feel the pain that somebody's feeling. And so few of us want to go there. So few of us have the ability to go there. But that's being real. That's being a real, authentic human being. To be with the things that we're feeling and to also, and be authentic about it, but also allow ourselves, when somebody else is in pain, to be with them.
And so feelings are gifts.
Yes.
From the unspoken world, the world you referred to. They're one of our greatest nudges and teachers along the way. I spent a long time in therapy, and someone asked me once what I did for 22 years, and I said I learned about boundaries. And one of the things I learned about boundaries are they're not right or wrong, they're simply your boundaries.
Yeah.
And anger is one of the clearest clarion bells of a boundary being transgressed.
Yeah.
And we live in a culture that likes to have joy and happiness bombarding the emotional space, but we take anger and pain and grief, and we like to lock that away for good in a vault. And so when something tragic happens, somebody loses their spouse to cancer, or they die, when something totally unexpected, something you thought would never happen to you, that you are completely unprepared to navigate, and let's face it, our culture doesn't do a good job of navigating these spaces for reasons that you've brought up. We're not only engaging in a journey that's very difficult and lonely, that meaning it's a solo journey, we're also living amidst a culture that would reward you for not even going there, for what it brings up to the culture at large. And so there are cultures that recognize the shaman, they recognize the elders, they recognize someone with some information or teachings that they need. But I'd like us to speak a bit to this propensity in the culture of, when you come back from the depths with your gifts, what was your experience in that realm with the culture, your community, when that interface happened?
It was different than I'd hoped, the response. And I think I have a brief story to tell about Western society. One of the things that I experienced in my journey was that I needed to go to things that are outside Western culture in order to understand what I had experienced. there are very few mechanisms within the context that's allowable in Western culture that help people on their journey. And so what I see in Western culture is a wasteland. And that's what we feel when we're hurting in Western society. We feel like there's nothing. I'm in this desert of hell. And I don't see a path. And so what I found myself doing was going on a path that didn't feel like my own path. I was borrowing bits of other paths from other cultures and things that are actually illegal in our culture. Like, I went on a journey with shaman in Peru on an ayahuasca journey, and it's illegal in this country to use ayahuasca, which is a tragedy, right? But at the same time, it's also kind of in Peru, ayahuasca is considered part of their national heritage, right? Like, so what's with that? I did 3 months of yoga at an ashram, another borrowed culture, right? And so, what's the story with that? Like, what happened there? And in my reading, Peter Kingsley writes about how the Pythagoreans, the ancient Greeks, that our culture comes from, the birthplace of our Western culture, the early ancient Greeks were whole in their manifestation of our culture. They embraced logic, and we would call it the Socratic process, but I'm talking about the pre-Socratics that were teaching Socrates. They practiced logic, but they also practiced mysticism. And Socrates decided that piece, I'm paraphrasing, but that piece was not for him. And so we have a society where we want to weigh and measure everything, but some things are beyond weighing and measuring. How can you quantify pain post-tragedy? In a kind of didactic culture, pain makes no sense.
And in our culture, it then gets pathologized.
Yes.
So
it's a problem.
Yes, these emotions, deep anger, grief, pain, we pathologize them, we other the person experiencing them as though we can't experience them ourselves, but it's out of fear. We don't want to experience them. We pathologize them and potentially put them in institutions, or they are separated out mentally, psychically from the rest of the population. They are the mentally ill. These are the addicts. Here's the heroes. Not understanding that we are all of it. And that if anyone had been in your shoes that day, we're not saying they would have gone through exactly what you went through or written the same book that you went through or had the same journey. What we are saying is it's a life-altering event no matter who you are, and what you choose to then do with it is up to you. But what I know is that honoring these deep emotions and these extreme emotions, there are gifts and jewels and learnings that come from being willing to descend and go there and feel that deep grief and sorrow, anger, pain. And I think one of the reasons we're scared of it as a society is precisely because of what you said. We like cool, distant logic. We like the scientific method. Whether it turns out to be right or not, we love being able to separate things out and go, this is what a rose does and this is what a thorn does. And when we do this, we take away the most important part of life, which is connection.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, in 2008, when I got behind the wheel and I, went out to the East Coast to write, I drove across the country, and I didn't turn on a radio. I didn't turn on music. I didn't turn on, kind of audio book or anything. I drove across Canada without no input. And for 4 days straight. And I don't know how I didn't, kind of pass out from dehydration. I was bawling my eyes out the whole way. And people who were driving past me must have thought, like, what is going on with that guy? And what I recognized was that I had so stifled any feeling from what happened in my life that the floodgates broke. And I think we're terrified of that. I think we're terrified of the floodgates and actually feeling, because we know that it's going to be like, it's going to be big. And it was. And one of the things I recognized was that I had so stifled any memory or any connection to the avalanche experience. I could not name the people who lost their lives. So here's this event that was like profoundly important and powerful, but I had completely objectified the people who died. Like 100%, they were just a number. And so the question then becomes, well, how do we do that as a culture? That's the invitation, is like, how do we actually go back and put names and feelings to things that we've experienced, because they're real. And so, beyond my grasp was, I knew Craig Kelly, but Vern Lunsford and, Naomi Heffler and, Kathy Kessler and, Dennis Yates. Like I wasn't able to name people. I wasn't able, to bring those people into my awareness and honor them. And that was painful, because I realized that I was trying not to care.
Because of what caring would mean, our culture, we have our own language for the things you're speaking to. In our culture, we would call that having a breakdown, of which I've had several myself, and it was very similar, a breaking through of emotion, dammed up emotion. What I realized, though, having a breakdown is some people's worst fear. It's the ego's worst fear, certainly. So it becomes the personality and the person's worst fear. But what a breakdown does, when you ask the question of how do we go from here to being that larger self or that self-empowered person, when you have a breakdown, what people fail to recognize, except those of us who've gone through it successfully, is that's when you get the chance to build yourself up again, but after another fashion. Mm-hmm. The breakdown is a necessary component to the journey that you speak to in your book. And relanguaging, I think it's really important to relanguage. A breakdown does the job. Mm-hmm. But it also sounds really scary, and it doesn't incorporate the other half of what's happening, which is you break down that which no longer serves.
Yeah, and in our culture, we're so afraid of death, but we have to die to ways of being, right? Like to and that's what rite of passage is fundamentally is that we're allowing the child in us to die, and we then adopt, the behaviors of an adult. And Campbell, talks and writes about, in his experience of different cultures, and in other cultures, the snake is revered because it actually sheds its skin so that it can grow. And that's important. That process is really important. Like, and at other points in my life, I remember saying to, people closest to me, well, I am who I am and I'm not going to change. That's a tragedy. Because what I'm essentially saying is, I don't want to grow. And I now feel that, if you were to take this conversation and like explode it out to the kind of larger cultural context in our society, we're being asked to go on a journey. Like on a big journey, all together. And all of the things that we've dreamed about becoming as human beings, that's the potential. Like to say that human beings are destined for always being warring and horrible in our behaviors, to say that that's our destiny, I don't believe that. I really fundamentally do not believe that that's our destiny. And to say that that's our destiny that's just unfair.
It's a failure of the imagination.
Yeah.
Not to mention potential realities. What we are going through right now is like mass shadow dancing. We are facing our shadow.
Yes.
As a species, not even as a culture or a society, as the human species. Our disowned psychic energy doesn't go away the same way your emotions didn't go away. They were in there. And it will break through. If it hasn't already completely broken through, it will break through, and it has to be faced in order to get to the other side. But like your journey, humanity does have the option to turn away again. Mm-hmm. And say that it doesn't see it or doesn't have the power to make it through to the other side. But you and I both know that the only thing that can save the human race is for us all collectively to walk through shadow.
Yeah. To own it, walk through it. As humans, we have the potential to be Hitler, but we also have the potential to be saints. And the biggest thing about Hitler was denial of everything, right? Like, and their culture was fundamentally, like the culture of the Nazi Party was fundamentally unsafe. It was an unsafe place to be for everyone. Like, it wasn't a club that you were in, and once you're in, you're safe. No, it was unsafe for everyone. And you know what? We're experiencing that right now. We're experiencing that here in Canada, where if you don't do what the party line is, things are unsafe for you. And so we now have an opportunity to shine a light on that and call it what it is. And, I've been accused of being self-righteous. I don't necessarily fully own the message that I'm trying to share with the world. it's not me. I'm talking about the larger story of being human that has been owned by people that are in our DNA for millennia. And the journey that I went on, I went through a process of bringing that into kind of a modern context, if you will. What I teach my students, I teach a risk management course for adventure, but what I'm really teaching them is about going on the journey, like becoming aware of the decisions that we make in shadow and how to bring them into the light.
In other words, it's age-old wisdom with an overstamp of your personal journey, including idiosyncrasies.
Mm-hmm. And I actually, I don't have a choice. Right? Like I don't have a choice in this. Like I can't do, it's something I can't not do. And for me, my language has always been the adventure space. There's no time in history where adventure has been more important. But it's the kind of adventure that we engage in that's the most important thing. This adventure of consumption and posting our successes on social media, that's not it. The adventure is also intrinsic and humble and shining a light on our shadow and finding our way to making choices that are open up our options rather than decrease our options. The adventure space is one where we're engaged in an environment that's real. And so much is subject to being modified or tweaked, and so we get to be in this space where we get to exercise our perceptions and question our perceptions and invite the perceptions of others and make decisions that have real consequence. But we're also at risk of behaving in an immature way where we fully claim our successes as being ours and never owning our failures. And that's fundamentally, that's adolescent behavior. And so I see the adventure space as being one where we actually become more human. We allow ourselves to accept the hardest things about the decisions that we've made and shining a light on them. Otherwise we imprison ourselves. We go out there because we think we want freedom, but freedom resides inside us. It's by telling the truth about who we are and our failings and our warts and our tweaked desires and shining a light on them. And truth isn't necessarily about saying what thoughts come around, because thoughts are a selection. Like I can choose to think something really horrible or choose to think something really great. Our thoughts are not who we are. Who we are is in our hearts. And I can't remember, you can probably help me with this, Margo. Somebody once said that the longest, hardest journey is from the head to the heart. And I think that adventure needs to go there. I really believe that it's the most important thing human beings could be doing right now, but in a certain way.
Adventure leads the individual, especially when it's ice climbing or backcountry skiing and dangerous avalanche terrain. It brings the individual into situations of high consequence, and therefore it focuses all of the human abilities you just taught, focuses the heart, the head, the logic, the data, everything. It focuses all into pinpoint precision in order to navigate situations of high consequence. And the reason adventure is so important today is globally, we are facing a situation of the highest of consequences. And the situation is not a temporal thing. The situation is, where do we want to go as a human species? Do we want to limit ourselves as a species? Do we want to go down a path that just puts us through a funnel where we all become collectivist AI technocracy? Or do we want to go down another path where we keep true adventure, but we also have to take the responsibility and own up to the truths of the freedom of being able to take that adventure?
Yeah, and freedom is coupled with responsibility, right? Like, we will have no, like, the manual for going out into the mountains is freedom of the hills. But what we don't often talk about is the responsibility. And you know, the narrative, or the, you know, like my journey of adventure was like when I was engaging, when, you know, Christmas in 1972, my brother gave me a trip to Banff National Park to go cross-country skiing. And that was freedom. That was freedom. And the narrative then was there is freedom in the hills, and I get to escape this insane culture. You know what? That insane culture is fully infused in the context of adventure in every nook and cranny on our globe. And so now what do? Where do we find freedom? We find freedom in responsibility and accountability and owning our journey, owning all the ugly stuff about it, of what it is. You know, being human, it's a nasty process. It is frickin' nasty. It's dirty, it's ugly, it's the quagmire. Like, I'm just reading Wade Davis's book, Into the Silence, and in it he describes World War I, and it's the human condition. It's like, it's fucking ugly. It's like body parts being blasted by shells and mud and quagmire and just destroying everything that, you know, is alive in, you know, kind of the war zone. And sometimes being human, it's that. It's the ugliest thing that you could possibly imagine. And that's the ugliness of it. And so how do we go from that place? How do we go from that? Like, I fundamentally think that we own that piece of being human. We don't forget it. But then we go from that place and we take ourselves to other places that are different than that. And you know, like if I was, you know, in the process of going out on an adventure, it's really important to ask ourselves, what's the worst thing that can happen today? Well, somebody could die in an avalanche. And okay, so how do we back engineer our way so that doesn't happen? But we look the other way. Oh, that's not going to happen. Well, it could. And I've had clients say to me, you know, well, why would you want to think about something like that? Well, that's because it's a reality of what can happen. And if I don't bring it into my awareness as a potential reality, then I'm not going to do the things that I need to do to mitigate it. So we start in the darkness and then we go to the light. We own and we articulate the darkest thing that could possibly happen. And then we find ourselves on a journey to the light. And at the end of the day, what we hope to be doing is having beautiful powder turns down like this incredible run. But we've done the whole process of mitigating the worst parts of ourselves in our decision making and owning them. That was the shocker to me, was the reality. When I woke up from being buried, it was like, I'm living a new reality now. And it sucked. So the best way to avoid that reality is to recognize that it is a truth. It is a truth, and how do I back engineer my way out of it? It's really fascinating because the Apollo missions went through the same thing. Apollo 1 ended in tragedy because they didn't realize how dangerous some of the processes that they were using. They'd gotten away with it in the Mercury and Gemini missions, and they pressurized the cabin to 16 pounds per square inch. They ended up with a fire and burning 3 astronauts on a plugs out test. They didn't even leave the ground. They hadn't gone to the worst case scenario. And so the worst case scenario manifested. And then when it manifested, the beautiful thing about what they did, and there, you can find online, hopefully you can still find them, is people saying, we screwed up. We really screwed up. We knew that what we were doing didn't have any quote unquote shelf life, and we looked the other way. We looked away from it and we just pretended it wasn't going to happen, and then it happened. But that's why they went to the moon, because they owned it. And so what I dream for adventure is that we gain the maturity to own our mistakes, all of them. And we support the process of other people going through and owning their errors and owning all of it. It's a messy quagmire like World War I, being human. One of the things I also wanted to say was that I had a ton of support post-incident. But it wasn't the support that I needed. So what I recognized was that I needed to go here, I needed to grow and change, but the supports I had were within the cultural construct. Here.
Comfortable.
Yeah. I had job offers. I had I found myself in a job at Thompson Rivers University or Caribou College. I had all kinds of these opportunities coming post-tragedy. And I don't know that it wasn't conscious. I think that people were trying to support me in the best way that they knew how. But what's really fascinating is that once I went on this journey and I, discovered what my what I contributed to this tragedy, people would support me individually, but not publicly. But that's also not fundamentally, totally true. John Buffrey, that guy's like a saint. Like, he recently called me up and he said, I want you to talk to, 35 snowboarders that are on this risk maturity course. Now, the fact that he's developed a risk maturity course, that's exactly what's needed. It's exactly what's needed. Like, how do we turn adventure into understanding that it's a process of being an adolescent and then an adult, and then hopefully one day, an elder. And I mean that in like the most beautiful terms. And does the elder actually even, is the elder busy like tagging grade 6 ice lines? No. Does the elder, in kind of ancient cultures, did they go to the battlefield anymore? No. But does the elder actually have something to say or wisdom to share? to help the community? Yes. One of the things that I sometimes, I'm concerned about is this idea that I don't get out there anymore. But here's why. I'm so busy pondering what this game is about.
Well, thanks for taking the journey, and thanks for bringing back the gifts, of which there are many, and thanks for coming on my podcast today.
Thanks for having me.